Good day, everyone. Today, we'll be talking about the first two chapters of John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. We will discuss Mill's remarks on ethics, the definition of utilitarianism, and some objections on utilitarianism. But let us first have a short background about John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was born in London in 1806. He was an influential philosopher, political economist, and later served as a member of parliament and worked for the East India Company. Educated by his father, a noted scholar, James Mill, and famed philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He grew up in a strict household under a firm father and was required to learn history, Greek, Latin, mathematics, and economic theory at a very young age. Actually, by the age of 3, Mill could read Greek. By the age of 8, he was reading Latin. And in 1863, he published one of his best-known works, Utilitarianism. For Mill's remarks on ethics, he notes that there has been little progress in ethics. Since the beginning of philosophy, the same issues have been debated over and over again, and philosophers continue to disagree sharply over the basic starting points of ethics. More so, Mill acknowledges that in the sciences, it is common to have disagreement about such bases or foundations. However, he argues that in science, particular truths can still have meaning even if you do not understand the principles underlying them. In contrast, in areas such as law or ethics, a statement unfounded upon a generally accepted theoretical basis has very little validity at all. Sa mga area na ito ng laws or ethics, all action exists to forward a particular end, kung kaya it would seem na yung rules of action natin ay magdedepend on what ends are being pursued. Therefore, Mill argues that in order to know what morality dictates, kailangan natin malaman kung anong standard ng human action yung i-judge, which in this case is the consequence. For the third, he called his principle of utility as the unrecognized foundation of our moral beliefs. Our moral beliefs have undergone little alteration over the course of history. Their durability implies that there exists some standard that serves as a solid, if unrecognized, foundation. Mill argues that this unrecognized standard is the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, which will be discussed later. So para malaman kung ano ba dapat ang basis or standard sa pag-judge ng actions ng tao, o para malaman kung tama o mali, kailangan ng solid na foundation. Pag hindi solid yung foundation, hindi rin magiging valid lahat ng statements na gagawin out of it. So para kay Mill, yung principle of utility niya, pwede nang maging standard kasi may solid foundation na to, pero hindi nire-recognize or tinatanggap ng iba. Kaya sabi ni Mill that his essay will reflect his attempt to add to the understanding and appreciation of utilitarianism. Before we go into details about utilitarianism, let us first have this situation. Imagine that James is an unemployed poor man in New York, and although he has no money, his family still depends on him. His unemployed wife, Alna, is sick and needs $500 for treatment, and their children, Anne and Chris, have been thrown out of school because they could not pay tuition fees worth $500 for both of them. James has no source of income and he cannot get our loan. Even John, his friend and a millionaire, has refused to help him. So from his perspective, there are only two alternatives. Either he pays by stealing or he does not. So let's ask ourselves, what would we do? How does one judge the morality of a decision or an act? Does one examine the motivation behind the decision and see whether the act is mostly motivated by goodness, or does one look at the results of the act? Let's use utilitarianism to assess the situation.
Utilitarianism focuses on the result, outcome, or consequence of the decision or act that will determine if one thing is right or wrong. Speaking of consequences, Mill's moral theory is considered as consequentialist in that it judges the rightness or wrongness of actions based on their consequences. It is also called the greatest happiness principle, which holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Pleasure and the absence of pain are the only things desirable as ends in themselves, the only things inherently good. Thus, any other circumstance, event, or experience is desirable only if it is a source of happiness. Actions are good when they lead to a higher level of general happiness, and bad when they decrease that level. In short, Mill holds that happiness, the power of pleasure over pain, is the goal of morality. We all desire happiness, and what we do now may be our happiness or a piece of it. For example, ang kaibigan mo ay nagda-diet. Sabihin nating nag-i-intermittent fasting siya at lagpas 6 p.m. na kaya di na siya pwedeng kumain. Palabas na sana kayo ng SM kasi tapos na kayong rumampa. Pero bago kayo makalabas ng exit, mapapadaan kayo sa Krispy Kreme. Favorite na favorite niya yung mga donut doon. At kung kakain siya ng donut, it will make her happy. Pero syempre ang mindset niya, hindi na siya kakain kasi past 6 p.m. na. Parang nananadya ang tadhana at may pa-promo si Krispy Kreme. Buy one, take three. Kaya nagkaroon siya ng dilema ngayon. Kakain ba ako o hindi? Sayang ang promo oh. Pero hindi siya makakapag-decide. Kaya ikaw na lang ang tatanungin niya. Beth, kakain ba akong Krispy Kreme ngayon? Syempre, gusto mo rin kumain dahil malapit na mag-dinner at masarap gawing appetizer ang donut. Kaya ang gagawin mo, ina-nudge mo siya ngayon. Sasabihin mo sa kanya, andun yung favorite mong flavor o best, pero fasting ka, di ba? Ikaw ang bahala kung saan ka masaya. Ang ending, kakain kayo ng donut. May laps lahat, everybody happy. Pero may tanong tayo tungkol sa happiness. Quality or quantity? Ang sabi ni Mill, a small dosage of love is more desirable or pleasurable than large amounts of sensual pleasures. Mas maganda raw na parang bite-size lang ang love, take note, love, compared to large amounts of sensual pleasures. Kahit gaano kadami ang quantity, pero if quality naman is like sa lower animals, wala lang din. We will discuss more on this sa objections, specifically Objection 1, Doctrine of the Swine. Ang tanong, paano naman kung large amounts of love at hindi sensual pleasures? Remember, ang lahat ng sobra ay nakasasama. So, quality or quantity? Let's go for quality. Kanina nasabi natin na pleasure and absence of pain will give us happiness. But how is that even possible, sabi ng iba? Kasi no pain, no gain, di ba? Ang sabi naman dito, a feeling of accomplishment is more pleasurable than the absences of pain. I think applicable dito sa mga taong may specific goal in mind. They are willing to endure physical pain to accomplish their goal, such as winning a sports competition. Example ay yung mga athletes na nag-workout at nag-gym at nagda-diet para maging fit sila sa mga competition. Achieving their goal, accomplishing their goal is their happiness. At yung pag-endure nila ng physical pain, ang kanilang means to achieve their goal. On the other hand, ito na sa opinion ko naman, ang mga taong chill lang, wala pang exact goal in mind, nasa status quo lang sila, I think mas gusto nila ang absence of pain. Dahil steady lang sila eh. Walang goal, carry lang, basta walang pain. Mabalik tayo sa ating dilemma kanina. Kung si James ay nagnakaw sa kanyang kaibigan, one could say that stealing is morally wrong. Therefore, we will say that what James has done, which is stealing from John, is morally wrong. Pero base sa utilitarianism, ang pagnanakaw na ginawa ni James ay morally right. For utilitarians, stealing in itself is neither bad nor good. What makes it bad or good is the consequences it produces. Sa example na ito, James stole from one person who has less need for money kasi nga milyonaryo na yung kaibigan niya, and he spent that money on 3 people who have more need for the money. Therefore, for utilitarians, James stealing from John, which is the means, can be justified by the fact that the money was used for the treatment of Alna and the tuition fees of Anne and Chris, which is the end. This justification is based on the calculation that the benefits of the theft outweigh the losses caused by the theft. James' act of stealing is morally right because it produced more good than bad. In other words, the action produced more pleasure or happiness than pain or unhappiness. That is, it increased net utility.
Ayan. So, syempre, sa lahat naman ng doctrines or ng philosophical theories, hindi mawawala yung objections. And dito sa utilitarianism, we listed 5 of them. Sa first one, it is called doctrine of the swine. It's a derogatory term kasi kino-compare nila yung utilitarian sa mga hayop, specifically sa baboy. Degrading to precisely because nami-misinterpret yung definition nila ng pleasure. Kasi yung pleasures ng swine do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. Sinabi na rin kanina na dito pumapasok yung concept ng quality versus quantity. And for John Stuart Mill, better na measure yung quality versus quantity. For example nga kanina, a small dosage of love is more pleasurable than large amounts of sensual pleasures. So dito, makikita na hindi naging basis yung gaano karami ang ino-offer. Ang naging basis is yung quality ng ino-offer. It's love versus sensual pleasures. So in short, yung pleasures associated with our mental aspect or yung higher faculties natin such as love, thinking, or friendship is more pleasurable compared sa pleasures associated sa lower faculty or sa bodily aspect natin, like yung physical sensation. On the second one, sinasabi naman na utilitarianism is all about pleasure. Yan, pleasure lang siya, period. Dito naman sinasabi ng utilitarians na yung definition ni Mill of happiness, hindi siya confined sa pleasure lang. He defined happiness as the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. Meron kasing stigma na kaakibat yung utilitarianism. It is often given the name expediency, which by definition is convenience despite immorality. So si Mill, he argued na malayo yung pagpapakahulugan ng utilitarian sa isang expedient. Kasi yung expedient, they only want what would benefit them. So yung goal nila is yung masunod yung interest lang nila. For example, yung minister, isa-sacrifice niya yung whole nation just to keep himself in position. However, sa concept ng utilitarian, iisipin niya muna kung ano yung makakabuti sa mas marami kahit na minsan kailangan niyang i-sacrifice yung pleasurable para sa kanya. Sa third objection naman, sinasabi na unattainable daw yung happiness na tinutukoy ng utilitarianism. And Mill answered this with his concept of utility principle. Sabi niya, a happy life doesn't mean a life full of pleasure. Siyempre, mixture pa rin daw ito ng pleasure and pain. Pero most of the time, mas nangingibabaw yung pleasure. A life without pain cannot be achieved, but with utility principle, the presence of pain would only be minimal. And kapag daw iniisip ng isang tao na yung happiness dapat continuous, dapat tuloy-tuloy lang, walang ibang mararamdaman, kundi pure happiness lang. Sa lahat ng oras, they will never achieve true happiness. Okay, sa fourth objection, ayan, sinasabi na masyadong mahirap naman daw i-achieve yung standard nito. Kasi Hindi naman talaga madali na dapat lagi mong iisipin yung makakabuti sa marami at hindi lang sa sarili mo. According to Mill, the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action. So, hindi nagmamatter kung ano yung reason mo or yung purpose mo kung bakit mo ginagawa ang isang bagay or ang isang decision. Ang nagmamatter lang is yung outcome or yung consequence ng ginawa mo. Utilitarians believe that it is better to do the wrong thing but live in a society full of good consequences than to do the right thing and live in a society full of bad consequences. And for the last objection, sinasabi na anti-religious daw ang utilitarianism. And ang sagot ng utilitarians, specifically ni Mill, if God desires the happiness of His people, then doing what He desires is a manifestation of following Him. So para sa utilitarians, utilitarianism is an interpretation of the will of God. Okay, so that's it for John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Thank you, and have a great day ahead.